I am very honored to have a part in this conversation. I was editor of American Heritage magazine for a long time, and there were many, very hard to sell a magazine of popular history because it was a real commercial magazine. We were vying for advertising with people, and I was always being pushed by the advertising side to show them how it's relevant, show them how it connects with today. So I was very fortunate to fall in with Rick, who has, I think, an unparalleled ability to effortlessly connect long ago struggles with contemporary concerns without bending or falsifying the terms, and without, and this is rarer, condescending to the people we're looking at long ago, because their dilemmas always seem somehow more simpler than ours, because they are, after all, over. And this very fine book that we're going to talk about tonight is sort of an exemplar of that. Rick has written a biography of George Washington, and you mustn't think, if you have read that you don't need to read this, because they're both wonderful in entirely different ways. And this is, among its other virtues, a sort of terrific postmodern biography. You can find and assemble the shape of the whole man and his career in it in the most interesting and oblique ways. But that's not the point of it. The point was to write a management guide, George Washington, on leadership. And there have been a lot of these, and of course one tends to think they'd be easy because at a certain level all generalizations hold true. So, Alexander the Great on management, you should be brave. So I approach this with the greatest interest, and in fact, and it's not a stretch. Let me read you the opening paragraph of it that sort of sets up the terms. It says, this is Rick writing, of course. America's greatest leader was its first, George Washington. He ran 2 startups, the Army and the Presidency, and chaired the most important committee meeting in history, the Constitutional Convention. His agribusiness and real estate portfolio made him America's richest man. He was as well known as any actress, rapper, or athlete today. Men followed him into battle, women longed to dance with him. Famous men, almost as great as he was, did what he told them to do. He was the founding CEO. And Rick goes on in this introduction to admit that, or to say, I have to admit that Washington never read a book like this. And then he quotes another man whose biographer he is, Gouverneur Morris, saying, "None know how to govern but those who have been used to it, and such men have rarely either time or inclination to write about it. The books, therefore, which are to be met with upon the subject contain mere utopian ideas." And you point out that by utopian he meant worthless.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And yet, wise as he was, I believe you think he's wrong.
Well, look, and I haven't been a leader either, but I have been writing and thinking about and living with George Washington for over a dozen years now, and certain things, strike you, certain patterns emerge, also a lot of surprises. I mean, there were things as I was writing this book that I did not know about. I mean, some of it I'd written about before. I'd written about the Constitutional Convention a number of times, many different angles. But I'd never written about George Washington and smallpox before. I'd never written about George Washington and latrines before. But these turned out to be, interesting lessons and problems that people face and how you deal with them.
Now, I was particularly, and I made a note here, that it was very interesting to me that you are starting to tell what an earlier generation would have called one of the grandest of all stories. We are starting with summoning a nation out of thin air and then giving it the working tools to make itself the most powerful on the planet. And yet, the early part of the book gives a good deal of attention to the very homely subject of field latrines. Why?
Well, this is a problem that Washington has to deal with beginning in the spring of 1775, when he's been chosen by the Continental Congress to be commander-in-chief, and he is sent to Boston to take over what were New England militias, which have now become the Continental Army. And nothing is in place. There has never been an American army. There have been armies in America, but they have been armies of European powers. The states have called up, or the colonies would call up militias from time to time, but there's never been any indigenous American army. So there are no procedures, there's no structure. Congress has created a kind of an ideal structure and put Washington at the top of it, but now he has to actually be there and see that everything gets done. And I discuss field latrines under the rubric of the obvious. And the obvious point, one would think, would be that, if you have a farm of 100 acres and you're out on the back 40 and nature calls, well, you do what you have to do. And that's fine. That's fine. And most of these soldiers are rural men and boys, so that's what they're used to. But when you have 20,000 men and boys all together in an army and nature calls, you can't do what you have to do. You have to have latrines. And then every 3 days or so, the old latrines have to be filled in, and the new latrines have to be dug. And if that doesn't happen, what happens is that your 20,000 men, many of them, become sick, and your number of effectives gets slashed. So this is a problem. Washington mentions it in his first general orders, the first general orders that he issues. There's a reference to this. And he keeps having to be on top of this problem for the first few years of his tenure as commander-in-chief. And he really doesn't get a handle on it until Baron von Steuben comes over, demonstrates his skill. We think of von Steuben as the great drill master of the Continental Army, which he was. We can talk about that and his contribution if you like. But von Steuben was also a great organizer, and he wrote a manual for the American Army which said, what is in a regiment, here is how a regiment is structured, here are the officers, here's what they all do. One of the functions was, when camp is set up, it shall be the responsibility of, I think it was the quartermaster. The quartermaster and his adjutant shall see that necessaries, which is the 18th century word, necessaries are dug. And then it shall be the responsibility of, some other officer to make sure that these get filled in and redug every 3 days. So you get a procedure in place, and then it becomes a self-replicating procedure, and then you make sure, then because of that, your soldiers are not going to get sick. Now, this is it's a very quotidian thing. It's kind of an amusing thing. We're anxious about bodily functions, and so we laugh as a sort of counter-phobic reaction to it. But, if you don't do this, don't bother to show up to the battles, because your soldiers, half of them will be sick, and the game is already lost.
And this was this under the management, your management category of sweating the small stuff?